Benson's Cafe sat at the edge of Oak Ridge, Montana, a small town that wasn't on the way to anywhere important. The morning light filtered through windows, clouded by decades of cigarette smoke, casting golden beams across worn linoleum floors. The scent of fresh coffee bacon and yesterday's grease hung in the air, comforting in its familiarity. A country song from the late 1980s, played softly from an ancient jukebox in the corner, the kind of music that spoke of heartbreak and highways and the American dream. At precisely 8:17 a.m., the same as every morning for the past 3 years, Eleanor Hayes pushed open the cafe door. The small brass bell above it announced her arrival with a gentle chime that few patrons bothered to acknowledge. Eleanor was 38, though the fine lines around her eyes told of experiences that had aged her beyond her years. She moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, the kind only a trained eye would notice, the kind that came from having bones surgically reconstructed after it had been shattered. She wore what she always wore, faded jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and a worn brown leather jacket that had seen better days. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, practical and unassuming. But there was something in her posture, ramrod straight, shoulders squared, chin slightly elevated, that spoke of discipline and command at odds with her otherwise unremarkable appearance. Eleanor made her way to the corner table, the one with a clear view of both the entrance and the kitchen exit. She sat with her back to the wall, a habit so ingrained she no longer recognized it as the tactical positioning it was. The waitress Doris, a 60-something woman with dyed red hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, didn't bother with pleasantries anymore. "Black coffee and wheat toast," Doris asked, already scribbling the order. Eleanor nodded, her eyes automatically scanning the room, cataloging faces, positions, potential threats, another habit she couldn't break. The cafe was half full with its usual morning crowd, a group of retired factory workers playing cards at one table, two off-duty sheriff's deputies discussing last weekend's fishing trip, a handful of solo diners buried in newspapers or phones, and then the whispers began. They always did. "That's her, the strange one. Barely says 2 words to anyone. Heard she lives up in that cabin on Miller's Ridge all alone. Something off about her, if you ask me." Eleanor had learned to tune out the whispers years ago. Small towns ran on gossip like cars ran on gasoline, and she had accepted her role as the local enigma. Better to be a mystery than to have them know the truth. Doris returned with her coffee and toast, setting them down with practiced efficiency. "Thanks," Eleanor said, her voice soft but clear. "Weather's turning," Doris commented, making her obligatory attempt at conversation. "They're saying snow by Thursday." "I heard," Eleanor replied, ending the exchange with practiced politeness. She took a sip of her coffee, allowing the bitter warmth to bring her fully into the present moment. The newspaper beside her remained folded and untouched. She didn't need to read it to know what was happening in the world. Some instincts never faded. Instead, her gaze drifted out the window to the main street of Oak Ridge, watching as the town slowly came to life under the autumn sky. The crash of a dropped plate from the kitchen made Eleanor's hand twitch toward her hip, where a sidearm would have been in another life. The movement was so swift, so automatic, that nobody noticed except for an older man seated 2 tables away. He observed with narrowed eyes as Eleanor forced her hand back to the table, her knuckles white as she gripped her coffee mug. Across the cafe, a group of Vietnam and Gulf War veterans had gathered for their weekly breakfast. Their laughter carried across the room as they swapped war stories that grew more impressive with each telling. Eleanor caught fragments of their conversation, talk of sandstorms, desert heat, radio communications failing at critical moments. Her lips twitched in a ghost of a smile, not of amusement, but recognition. 3 clicks from the extraction point, and Cooper says he's lost the damn coordinates. The veterans erupted in laughter, their camaraderie built on shared experiences that civilians could never truly understand. Eleanor's gaze lingered on them for a moment too long, and one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, caught her watching. He gave her a curious look, perhaps sensing something familiar in her posture, in the way she held herself. Eleanor quickly looked away, back to her cooling coffee. The cell phone in her pocket vibrated. She tensed her body, going completely still. The phone was a basic model used only for emergencies, and it hadn't rung in 18 months. With deliberate calm that belied her sudden racing heart, Eleanor removed the phone and checked the screen. Unknown number. She stepped outside to take the call, moving with that slight, careful limp to the edge of the cafe's parking lot. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. She pressed the phone to her ear, but said nothing. Saber Actual, said a male voice on the other end of the line, the code name she hadn't heard in 12 years. Eleanor's posture shifted immediately, spine straightening shoulders, squaring chin, lifting. In the space of a heartbeat, the unassuming woman from the cafe vanished, replaced by someone else entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes, United States Army Special Strategic Division. This line isn't secure, she replied, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of command. Neither is the world, Colonel. There was a pause. It's Reynolds. We need to talk. I'm retired, General. The word retired carried a weight of bitterness. Not according to the Pentagon, you're not. You're listed as inactive reserve status, a technicality that's about to become very relevant. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, memories washing over her with the force of a flash flood. The Tactical Operations Center in Iraq, the satellite feeds showing the Delta Force team moving into the kill zone, the commanders refusing to believe her assessment, her decision to break the chain of command. Red Dune is classified, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are you bringing this up now? Because the files are being unsealed for a congressional hearing next week. There are people who still want to bury what happened, and you along with it. Reynolds' voice grew more urgent. I've been searching for you for 3 years, Colonel. We need to set the record straight. The record is what they decided it would be, General. I disobeyed direct orders, remember? Even if those orders would have killed 42 men. That's exactly why Reynolds stopped abruptly. I'm not discussing this over the phone. I'll find you. Don't bother, Eleanor said, but the line had already gone dead. She stood motionless in the parking lot, the phone still clutched in her hand as the past she had spent years burying clawed its way back to the surface. Red Dune. The mission designation still sent a chill through her body that had nothing to do with the Montana morning. When she returned to her table in the cafe, something had changed. The casual observer wouldn't have noticed, but Eleanor Hayes now moved differently. Her eyes, once careful to avoid direct contact, now assessed each person in the room with military precision. Her limp, though still present, seemed less pronounced, as if her body remembered a different way of being in the world. The unassuming woman who had entered Benson's cafe an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who carried the invisible weight of command. As she dropped a $5 bill on the table and prepared to leave, the door to the cafe swung open. A man in his early 40s entered, pausing to scan the room with the practiced eye of someone who noticed details for a living. Mark Sullivan was Oak Ridge's local newspaper editor, an occasional investigative reporter, a career downshift from his former life as a combat journalist, with 3 embeds in Iraq and Afghanistan. He spotted Eleanor and changed direction, heading straight for her table. Hayes, he said, his voice carrying a warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mind if I join you for a minute? Eleanor assessed him quickly. 6'1" athletic build maintained despite civilian life, the subtle scan of exits as he entered the room, the slight favoring of his right leg. Military once upon a time, perhaps Marines based on the faded tattoo partially visible at his wrist. I was just leaving, Mr. Sullivan, she replied, gathering her things. That's a shame. I was hoping to ask you about Operation Red Dune. The cafe seemed to go silent, though the ambient noise continued unchanged. Eleanor's face remained perfectly composed, betraying nothing but inside alarms were blaring. She met his gaze directly for the first time. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice steady. Sullivan smiled, the expression of a man who had just confirmed a theory. Interesting, because I never mentioned it was a military operation. Yet you didn't ask what it was. Eleanor remained silent, evaluating options, escape routes, threat level. Old habits that had kept her alive in combat zones from Baghdad to Kandahar. May I? Sullivan asked, pulling out the chair across from her without waiting for permission. He sat down, placing a thin manila folder on the table between them. I've been working on a story for a while now about a classified mission in Iraq 2003, a Delta Force team that was somehow extracted minutes before being overrun, despite their commanding officers writing them off as a lost cause. Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but her eyes had gone cold. Sounds like the plot of a movie, not a story for the Oak Ridge Weekly. Sullivan leaned forward, lowering his voice. Before I came to this town, I was embedded with the 10th Mountain Division in Iraq. I was supposed to cover a routine operation that suddenly went dark. No access, no information, complete media blackout. 3 days later, I saw body bags being loaded onto a transport casualties that officially never happened. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Because when I started digging into what really happened, I kept hitting classified walls. But one name surfaced in whispers, a lieutenant colonel who defied orders and coordinated an unauthorized extraction. A woman who ended what had been a promising military career with one decision. Sullivan tapped the folder. I have a partial service record here. Most of it's been redacted, but what's left is impressive. Eleanor stood, her movement fluid despite the limp. You should be careful, Mr. Sullivan. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Maybe he conceded, remaining seated. Or maybe some stories need to be told because people in power tried to bury them. People who'd rather hide their mistakes than acknowledge that a woman saved 42 elite operators when they had been abandoned by their own command structure. The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. For years, she had lived with her decision, the lives saved, the career destroyed, the official reprimand that called her actions reckless insubordination, rather than what they were, the only moral choice available. You don't know what you're talking about, she said, but there was less conviction in her voice. I know enough to recognize that you move like military, Sullivan replied, his eyes tracking her posture. I know you sit with your back to the wall and eyes on the entrance. I know you check sight lines and exits in any room you enter. And I know that limp is from a combat injury, not a car accident like you told Doris. Eleanor leaned down, placing both palms flat on the table, her face inches from his. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of command. Listen carefully, Mr. Sullivan. You're playing with things you don't understand. If you value your safety, you will drop this story and never mention Operation Red Dune again. Are we clear? Sullivan didn't flinch. Crystal clear, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. Eleanor straightened, turned, and walked out of the cafe, the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Outside, she took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air of her, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. 12 years of careful anonymity, of rebuilding a life piece by piece, threatened to collapse around her in the space of a single morning. She drove her aging Jeep Cherokee up into the mountains to the small cabin she had purchased with her military pension. The structure was simple, 2 bedrooms, a combined kitchen and living area, a small bathroom, but it had become her sanctuary. More importantly, it was defensible with clear lines of sight in all directions and multiple exit routes through the surrounding forest. Old habits. Inside, Eleanor moved directly to the bedroom closet. Behind a row of flannel shirts and jeans, she unlocked a hidden panel in the wall. The small compartment contained a Beretta M9 service pistol, 3 passports with different names, but her photograph, a stack of cash in various currencies, and a satellite phone that hadn't been activated in years. The go-bag of someone who never truly believed they were safe. But it was the metal box at the back of the compartment that she reached for now. She hadn't opened it since moving to Oak Ridge, hadn't needed the reminder of who she used to be. The box contained her military decorations, including a silver star that had been awarded quietly without ceremony months after she had been forced to resign her commission. Along with the medals was a single photograph, Eleanor in desert camouflage, standing with a group of Delta Force operators whose faces had been deliberately blurred to protect their identities. Only hers remained clear, younger, more confident, unbroken. That night, the nightmares returned with savage intensity. In her dreams, Eleanor was back in the Tactical Operations Center at Camp Liberty, Baghdad. The air conditioning struggled against the desert heat and the warmth generated by dozens of computer terminals and communication equipment. Screens displayed real-time satellite imagery, troop movements, and intelligence feeds from across the theater of operations. She stood at her station, eyes fixed on the satellite feed tracking Delta Force Team Sigma as they approached their target, a high-value terrorist cell leader believed to be hiding in a compound near Fallujah. As the team's forward observer, Eleanor's job was to monitor the satellite imagery, identify potential threats, and relay critical information to the ground team. Something about the pattern of movement around the compound caught her attention. Small heat signatures moving in a coordinated pattern, taking positions along the Delta team's most likely extraction route. To an untrained eye, they might have looked like random civilians, but Eleanor had spent thousands of hours analyzing insurgent tactics. Sir, she said, turning to Colonel Matheson, the operation commander. I'm seeing what looks like an ambush formation along Route Bravo. Recommend redirecting Sigma to extraction point Charlie instead. Matheson barely glanced at her screen. Those are confirmed as local shepherds, Lieutenant Colonel. Intelligence cleared that area an hour ago. With respect, sir, the movement patterns are consistent with insurgent positioning. They're too coordinated, too deliberate. Major Phillips, the intelligence officer, looked over with barely concealed disdain. Your concern is noted, Hayes, but my team has already cleared that route. Those are civilians. Eleanor pressed on, pointing to specific heat signatures on her screen. Sir, look at their positioning. They're establishing interlocking fields of fire. This isn't random civilian movement. That's enough, Lieutenant Colonel, Matheson snapped. You're overstepping your role. Major Phillips has primary intelligence authority on this operation. Eleanor watched in mounting horror as Delta Team Sigma continued toward the kill zone, unaware of the trap closing around them. She had seconds to decide: follow the chain of command or trust her judgment and experience. So request permission to alert Sigma to possible ambush conditions. Denied, Hayes, stay in your lane. The dream shifted as dreams do, compressing time and space. Eleanor saw herself breaking protocol, using an emergency channel to contact the Air Force Combat Controller embedded with Delta Team Sigma. She saw herself coordinating with a nearby Apache helicopter unit, redirecting them from their assigned patrol to provide immediate air support. She heard herself calmly relaying coordinates, directing precision strikes against the hidden insurgent positions just as they began opening fire on the surrounded Delta operators. And then the dream shifted again to the aftermath. The formal reprimand. The classified hearing where she stood alone before a panel of senior officers defending her decision to break the chain of command. The cold fury in Colonel Matheson's eyes as he described her actions as dangerous insubordination that undermined the integrity of command authority. The quiet acknowledgement from a few officers that while she had violated protocol, she had also saved the lives of 42 special operators. The final scene was always the same: General James Reynolds, then a lieutenant colonel and the commander of Delta Team Sigma, standing before her in a deserted Pentagon hallway after the hearing. They're forcing you out, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. They're giving me the option to resign my commission or face a court-martial, Eleanor corrected him. For saving my men, this is insanity. It's politics, sir. Someone has to take the fall for the intelligence failure, and it won't be Major Phillips or Colonel Matheson. They have connections I don't. Reynolds' face hardened. This isn't right, Hayes. No, sir, it isn't. But it's how the game is played. She straightened her uniform, squaring her shoulders. The official record will show that I defied the chain of command, endangering an operation through reckless action. The men know the truth, Reynolds said quietly. I know the truth. The truth doesn't matter, sir. Only the record does. Eleanor woke with a gasp, sweat-soaked sheets twisted around her body, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. She sat up, running, trembling hands through her hair, trying to shake off the ghosts of the past. She had made her peace with her decision years ago. 42 men had returned home to their families instead of coming back in flag-draped coffins. That knowledge had sustained her through the loss of her career, through the physical rehabilitation after her medical discharge, the official reason for her departure from the Army, through the years of anonymity in small-town Montana. But now the past was catching up. Reynolds' call, Sullivan's investigation, the carefully constructed walls between Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes and the quiet woman who drank black coffee at Benson's Cafe were crumbling. Eleanor moved to the cabin's front window, looking out at the moonlit forest surrounding her home. For 12 years, she had lived with the knowledge that she had done the right thing at the cost of everything she had worked for. She had learned to live with the whispers behind her back, these suspicious looks from the people who sensed she was hiding something. She had accepted her exile. But perhaps after all this time, the truth would finally come to light. The question was she ready to face it as the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon? Eleanor Hayes made her decision. If Reynolds was coming, if the files were being unsealed, she would stand her ground. She had run from the past long enough. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it head-on, as she had faced every challenge in her life. She was no longer just a woman with a mysterious past. She was Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes again, and she was ready for the fight. The following morning, Eleanor returned to Benson's Cafe at her usual time. She took her regular seat, ordered her usual black coffee and wheat toast. But something about her had changed, a subtle shift in how she held herself, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there the day before. The whispers still followed her, but now they seemed to slide off her like water off stone. Mark Sullivan arrived 15 minutes later, taking the seat across from her without invitation. This time she didn't object. "You've been busy," she said, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "I made some calls to former colleagues. Cross-referenced some dates." Sullivan's voice was low, respectful. "I know what really happened during Red Dune now. Not all of it, but enough." Eleanor took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving his face. And I think America deserves to know about the officer who sacrificed her career to save 42 of our best operators. Especially now when the congressional hearing might try to rewrite history. It won't be that simple, Eleanor warned. There are powerful people who still want this buried. Sullivan smiled grimly. "I've gone up against powerful people before. It's kind of my specialty." Before Eleanor could respond, a ripple of attention moved through the cafe. Outside, a convoy of black SUVs with government plates had pulled up, flanked by military police vehicles. The morning chatter died as patrons turned toward the windows, straining to see what was happening. The cafe door opened, and a tall, distinguished man in a full-dress uniform stepped inside. 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder of his immaculately pressed jacket. His chest carried rows of decorations that told the story of a lifetime of service, campaign ribbons from Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq. His face was weathered by years under harsh suns and distant lands, but his blue eyes remained sharp, taking in every detail of the small-town cafe. General James Reynolds had arrived. The patrons of Benson's Cafe froze, forks stopped midair, and coffee cups trembling in suddenly unsteady hands. The group of veterans at their regular table stood, automatically ingrained respect for the stars on the general's shoulders overriding their curiosity. Reynolds ignored them all. His eyes scanned the room with military efficiency until they found Eleanor Hayes. For a moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate steps that echoed in the hushed cafe, he walked directly to her table. Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, her spine straightening, her chin lifting almost imperceptibly. Gone was any trace of the unassuming woman who had hidden in this small town for years. In her place stood a soldier, a commander facing her superior officer. General Reynolds stopped precisely 3 feet from her. His weathered face softened almost imperceptibly as he looked into the eyes of the woman who had saved his life and the lives of his men 12 years ago. Then, in a move that sent shockwaves through the silent cafe, he raised his right hand in a formal salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "it's an honor to see you again." Eleanor's eyes glistened with sudden emotion, but her voice remained steady as she returned his salute with perfect military precision. "You didn't have to do that, General." Reynolds lowered his hand, a sad smile crossing his face. "After everything you did, Lieutenant Colonel, it's the very least I can do." The cafe erupted in whispers as the patrons tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. The strange, quiet woman with the limp, a lieutenant colonel. The object of a 4-star general's respect, Reynolds turned slightly, addressing the room at large, but speaking directly to the group of veterans who remained standing at attention. "This woman," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "is Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes, the first female combat strategist in Special Strategic Division. And she saved more soldiers than any of you will ever know." The whispers grew louder as Reynolds turned back to Eleanor, placing a small box on the table between them. Inside lay a Silver Star Medal, one of the nation's highest honors for valor in combat. "In 2003, during Operation Red Dune, our unit was ambushed in the desert outside Fallujah." Reynolds continued, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "We were outnumbered 5-1. Command had written us off, but she didn't. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes defied direct orders, redirected air support, and pulled 42 of us out of hell itself." Gasps spread through the cafe as the full impact of his words sank in. Reynolds gestured to the medal. "The Department of Defense wants to present you with full honors at the Capitol next week, Colonel. It's long overdue." Eleanor looked down at the Silver Star, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. All the memories she had buried for years came flooding back. The screaming radios, the frantic coordination with the Apache pilots, the knowledge that her career was ending even as she saved those men. I didn't do it for honors, General, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I just wanted those men to make it at home. The cafe fell silent again, but this time it wasn't from shock or curiosity. It was from awe, the sudden collective realization that they had been sharing their town with a hero and never known it. The same people who had whispered behind her back, who had labeled her strange or standoffish, now looked at Eleanor Hayes with new eyes. Doris the waitress approached with a fresh pot of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she refilled Eleanor's cup. I'm so sorry, ma'am, she whispered. We never knew. Eleanor offered a faint smile. That's all right, Doris. Most heroes go unseen. General Reynolds straightened, saluting once more before turning to leave. At the door, he paused and addressed the room one final time. From this day forward, he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a man accustomed to having his orders followed, don't ever ignore someone because they seem ordinary. Some of the greatest warriors this country has ever known look just like her. He walked out the door, swinging shut behind him. But the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was reverent. When Eleanor Hayes left Benson's cafe that morning, everyone stood. For the first time in 12 years, people really saw her. And as she stepped out into the morning light, the clouds that had threatened rain all morning began to part, allowing the sun to break through in golden beams that seemed to illuminate her path forward. Sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest stories. And Eleanor Hayes was finally ready to let hers be heard. The evening following General Reynolds' appearance at Benson's cafe brought a thunderstorm that rolled across the Montana mountains with military precision. Rain lashed against the windows of Eleanor Hayes' cabin as lightning illuminated the surrounding forest in stark blue-white flashes. Inside, 3 people sat at her kitchen table, an unlikely war council gathered around topographic maps and classified documents spread across the wooden surface. Eleanor had changed into clothing that better reflected her true identity, a simple black tactical shirt, and cargo pants clothing that allowed freedom of movement without drawing attention. The transformation was subtle but profound. The unassuming woman from the cafe had vanished, replaced by someone who moved with purpose and precision. General Reynolds stood at the window, his formal uniform exchanged for civilian attire, dark slacks and a button-down shirt that couldn't quite disguise his military bearing. Mark Sullivan sat across from Eleanor digital recorder on the table between them, his journalist notebook open to a page already half filled with his precise handwriting. Let me make sure I understand the timeline, Sullivan said, glancing between his notes and the 2 military officers. In 2003, during Operation Red Dune, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes identified an ambush pattern that intelligence had missed. When command refused to alter the mission parameters, she broke protocol to redirect air support and extract the Delta Force team. Reynolds nodded, his gaze still fixed on the storm outside. 42 operators, including myself. We were minutes away from being overrun. He turned his weathered face solemn in the cabin's dim light. The official investigation concluded that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes acted rashly, endangering the mission by countermanding direct orders. She was given the option to resign or face court-martial. But that wasn't the truth, Sullivan pressed. Truth is the first casualty of bureaucratic self-preservation, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of long-held bitterness. Major Phillips' intelligence assessment was catastrophically wrong, but he had connections in Washington. Colonel Matheson couldn't admit he'd dismissed my warnings. Someone had to take the fall. Lightning flashed again, casting harsh shadows across Reynolds' face as he moved back to the table. What Colonel Hayes did was the definition of moral courage, choosing to do what's right despite personal consequences. But the military runs on the chain of command, and she broke it. To save your lives, Sullivan noted. To save our lives, Reynolds confirmed. And now the same people who buried the truth 12 years ago are trying to ensure it stays buried. The congressional hearing next week is supposed to be about accountability, but it's really about controlling the narrative. Sullivan leaned forward. You mentioned in files being unsealed. What exactly are we talking about? Reynolds produced a flash drive from his pocket, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it might detonate. Operational records, communication logs, satellite imagery, after-action reports, all the evidence that shows Eleanor's assessment was correct and the command structure failed. He placed the drive on the table. I've spent 3 years gathering this using contacts still loyal to truth rather than career advancement. Eleanor stared at the small device, her throat suddenly tight. For 12 years, she had lived with the knowledge that she had been right, that her actions had saved lives, but without the vindication of official acknowledgement. Now the proof lay before her, contained in a piece of technology smaller than her thumb. "Why now?" she asked, looking up at Reynolds. "After all this time, why is this suddenly coming to light?" Reynolds' expression darkened. "Because Colonel Matheson is about to become Lieutenant General Matheson with oversight of Special Operations Command. His nomination goes before the Senate next month. Some of us believe a man who abandoned his operators and scapegoated a subordinate to cover his mistakes shouldn't be given that kind of authority." The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. This wasn't just about clearing Eleanor's name, it was about the future of military leadership, about who would command America's most elite warriors in future conflicts. Sullivan broke the silence. "So what's the plan? You present this evidence at the hearing, expose the cover-up, and then what?" "It's not that simple," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. The movement revealed her limp more prominently than usual, a reminder of the physical price she'd paid along with her career. "Matheson has powerful allies. They'll fight back, discredit the evidence, question Reynolds' motives, paint me as disgruntled and unstable. Which is why we need your story on record beforehand," Reynolds said to Sullivan. "Public pressure changes the equation. Once the American people know what really happened, the hearing committee won't be able to sweep it under the rug so easily." Eleanor moved to the window, watching the storm rage. The parallels weren't lost on her, the external chaos mirroring the turmoil within. For years she had accepted her exile, found a measure of peace in her anonymous life. Now she was being asked to step back into the spotlight to fight a battle she had once conceded. "What about the risks to you, General?" she asked without turning. "You're putting your own career on the line by championing this cause." Reynolds' reflection in the window showed a grim smile. "I'm 58 years old, Colonel. I've served my country for 36 years. If the price of doing what's right is my fourth star, I can live with that." His voice dropped lower. "Can you live with staying silent while Matheson takes command of the very operators he once abandoned?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but not unacknowledged. Eleanor knew the answer already. She had made her choice the moment she accepted Reynolds into her home, the moment she agreed to hear Mark Sullivan out. Some battles couldn't be avoided, no matter how much one might wish for peace. Sullivan cleared his throat. "There's something else you both should know." He pulled out his phone, tapping through to a series of photographs. "I've been investigating Matheson for months, well before I connected him to Eleanor's story. His nomination isn't the only thing happening next month." He placed the phone on the table. The screen showed Colonel Robert Matheson in civilian clothes meeting with a man whose face was partially obscured. This was taken 2 weeks ago outside a private airfield in Virginia. The man with Matheson is Victor Baranov, a known arms dealer with ties to several hostile foreign intelligence services. Reynolds' posture stiffened, his military training immediately recognizing the implications. "You're suggesting Matheson is compromised." "I'm suggesting there's more at stake than just setting the historical record straight," Sullivan replied. "Whatever Matheson is involved in, it goes beyond covering up past mistakes. He has meetings scheduled with defense contractors the day after his confirmation hearing. Something big is in motion." Eleanor returned to the table, studying the photograph with the practiced eye of an intelligence analyst. The location, the timing, the absence of security, this wasn't an authorized meeting. She looked up at Reynolds. "If Matheson is engaged in treasonous activity, exposing the Red Dune cover-up might not be enough. We need to understand what he's planning." The storm outside intensified, thunder cracking directly overhead. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. "I have contacts in Washington who might be able to get more information," Sullivan offered. "But we're running out of time. The hearing is in 5 days. Reynolds nodded grimly. "I'll need to return to D.C. tonight. I can't be absent too long without raising questions." He turned to Eleanor. "The question remains, Colonel, are you in? Because once this starts, there's no turning back. Matheson and his allies will come at you with everything they have." Eleanor's face hardened with resolve. The woman who had hidden in Oak Ridge for years was gone completely, now replaced by the battle-hardened officer she had once been, the strategist who had made impossible decisions under the most extreme pressure. "I've been running for 12 years, General. Maybe it's time I stood my ground." The decision made, they spent the next 2 hours formulating their approach. Sullivan would publish an initial article outlining Eleanor's story, carefully redacting classified details, while establishing the core narrative of a decorated officer forced out for saving lives. Reynolds would secure allies within the Pentagon officers who remembered Red Dune and had questioned the official account. Eleanor would prepare for the hearing, reviewing the operational records and rehearsing her testimony. As the meeting concluded, Sullivan paused at the door. "There's something else you should prepare for, Colonel. When this breaks, you won't just be facing military and political opposition. The media scrutiny will be intense. Every aspect of your life, your service, your time in Oak Ridge, it'll all become public property." Eleanor nodded, understanding the warning. Privacy had been her shield for years, anonymity, her armor. Both would be stripped away in the coming storm. After Sullivan left to file his initial story, Reynolds lingered. The two officers stood in Eleanor's kitchen, separated by rank, but united by shared experience. The comfortable silence between them spoke of mutual respect forged in combat, a bond that transcended the years and the distance that had grown between them. "You could have found me sooner," Eleanor said finally, the question that had nagged at her since his arrival. Reynolds' expression softened. "I could have, but you deserve peace, however temporary. I didn't want to drag you back until it was absolutely necessary." He looked around the simple cabin. "You built a life here." "I built a hiding place," she corrected him. "There's a difference." The general nodded, understanding. "For what it's worth, I never stopped fighting for you behind the scenes. Every promotion, every new assignment gave me more influence to push for the truth. It just took longer than I expected." "The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine," Eleanor quoted with a faint smile. "Let's hope so." Reynolds checked his watch. "My detail is waiting. We'll be in contact through secure channels from now on." Sullivan's revelation about Matheson changes the stakes. This isn't just about setting the record straight anymore. "It never is," Eleanor replied, walking him to the door. "War is always more complicated than it first appears." After Reynolds departed, Eleanor stood on her porch watching the taillights of his convoy disappear down the mountain road. The storm had passed, leaving behind the fresh, sharp scent of pine and rain-washed earth. The night sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. In the distance, the lights of Oak Ridge twinkled in the valley below. For 12 years, that town had been her refuge, a place where Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes could disappear and a simpler woman could emerge. Now that refuge was compromised, that simpler life at an end. Whatever happened in the coming days, she could never return to anonymity. Inside, Eleanor opened the hidden compartment in her bedroom closet. Behind the gun and the passports lay a metal case she hadn't touched in years. She withdrew it carefully, setting it on her bed. The combination lock yielded to the date of the Red Dune operation, a number burned into her memory. Inside was her dress uniform, preserved with military precision. The lieutenant colonel's oak leaves on the shoulders, the campaign ribbons and service medals arranged in perfect order. The name tag, Hazy Eleanor, ran her fingers over the fabric, memories flooding back. The day she had received her commission, her first command. The moment in the TOC when she had made the decision that ended her career but saved 42 lives. The uniform represented everything she had been and everything that had been taken from her. She closed the case. It was time to reclaim not just her honor, but her identity. The following morning brought a new reality to Oak Ridge. Mark Sullivan's article had hit the national news wires overnight, and by sunrise, the first news vans were arriving in town. The headline was impossible to miss: "Hero or Renegade, the untold story of the officer who sacrificed her career to save Delta Force." Eleanor watched the chaos unfold from her cabin, monitoring local news and social media. Sullivan had done his job well. The article presented her side without overreaching, included supporting statements from unnamed operators who had been part of Delta Team Sigma, and raised pointed questions about the handling of the investigation. It was factual, compelling, and most importantly, it was gaining traction. Her phone, the secure satellite model Reynolds had provided, rang at precisely 900. "They've taken the bait," Reynolds said without preamble. "Matheson has called an emergency meeting with his allies in the Pentagon. His press team is already working on a rebuttal statement." "How's the reaction within the military community?" Eleanor asked, her tactical mind already assessing battlefields, both public and private. "Mixed. The old guard is closing ranks around Matheson's chain of command is sacred doctrine to them. But among the operator community, especially those who remember Red Dune, There's significant support for you. Several have reached out offering to testify if needed. That was something, at least. In the coming battle, they would need allies at every level. What about Sullivan's revelation regarding Baranov? She pressed. Reynolds' voice dropped. That's where it gets interesting. I've called in some favors with intelligence contacts. Baranov isn't just an arms dealer. He's a broker for military technology, specializes in next-generation weapon systems. Eleanor's mind raced connecting dots. And Matheson is positioned to influence acquisition decisions for Special Operations Command if his promotion goes through. Exactly. The potential for compromise is significant. She paced her small living room, the strategic analyst, in her constructing and discarding scenarios. We need more. Sullivan's photo is suggestive but not conclusive. Matheson could claim it was an authorized intelligence operation or deny knowing Baranov's background. My team is working on it, Reynolds assured her. For now, focus on preparing for the hearing. Your testimony is still our strongest weapon. After ending the call, Eleanor made a decision. Hiding in her cabin while reporters swarmed Oak Ridge wouldn't serve their cause. If this battle was to be fought in the open, she would face it head-on. She dressed carefully, not in uniform, but in clothes that projected quiet confidence. Dark slacks, a blue button-down shirt, a tailored jacket. Professional, presentable, but not trying too hard. The woman who walked down from the mountain that morning wasn't the Eleanor Hayes that Oak Ridge had known for years, nor was she fully the lieutenant colonel of the past. She was something new, a synthesis of both identities forged in the crucible of renewed purpose. Benson's Cafe had become ground zero for the media invasion. Reporters and camera crews packed the small establishment, interviewing locals about the mysterious woman they had never truly known. Doris was holding court near the register, her previous indifference to Eleanor transformed overnight into protective admiration. She's always been dignified, you know, Doris was telling a reporter from a national network. Never complained, never made a fuss. Looking back, I should have seen the military in her, the way she always sat facing the door, how she noticed everything. The cafe fell silent when Eleanor entered. Cameras swiveled toward her, microphones extended like weapons. Questions erupted from all sides, a cacophony of journalistic eagerness. Eleanor raised a hand, and to everyone's surprise, the room quieted. I'll make a brief statement, she said, her voice carrying the natural authority of command. 12 years ago, I made a decision that saved the lives of 42 American special operators who had been abandoned by their command structure. I paid for that decision with my career. The full truth of Operation Red Dune will be revealed at the congressional hearing next week. She paused, surveying the room with calm confidence. Until then, I have nothing further to add. She turned to leave, ignoring the renewed barrage of questions when a voice rose above the others. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. Eleanor turned back. A man in his 60s stood from a corner table, one of the veterans who gathered weekly for breakfast. He stepped forward, his posture straightening as he approached her. Master Sergeant James Cooper, retired, ma'am. 5th Special Forces Group. He saluted with parade ground precision. My son was with Delta Team Sigma in 2003, Operation Red Dune. The cafe went silent again, but this time with a different quality, a reverence for what was unfolding before them. Eleanor returned the salute automatically, military muscle memory overriding civilian habit. At ease, Sergeant. Cooper's eyes glistened with emotion barely held in check. My son never told me exactly what happened that day, classified, he said. But he did tell me that when everyone else had written them off, a female officer in the TOC broke protocol and brought them home. He extended his hand. I never knew who to thank until today. Eleanor took his hand, her own composure threatening to crack. Your son and his teammates did the hard part, Sergeant. I just made sure they had the support they needed. Cooper shook his head. With respect, ma'am, that's not how my boy tells it. He says there were moments out there when they thought they'd been forgotten. Then your voice came over the radio, calm, as could be saying help was on the way. His grip tightened. You have friends in this fight, Colonel, more than you know. The moment transformed everything. What had been a media circus became something else, a public recognition of service and sacrifice. Other veterans in the cafe stood forming an impromptu honor guard as Eleanor made her way back to the door. No more questions were shouted, no cameras thrust in her face. The journalists, sensing the gravity of what they were witnessing, showed uncharacteristic restraint. Outside, Eleanor found Mark Sullivan waiting beside her Jeep. "That wasn't the plan," he said, though his expression showed approval. "But it worked." The visual of Cooper saluting you the other vets standing in respect, that's the kind of imagery that changes public perception overnight. "It wasn't calculated," Eleanor replied, unlocking her vehicle, "which makes it even more powerful." Sullivan held up his phone showing a news alert. "Reynolds called. Matheson has issued a statement denying any wrongdoing and questioning your mental stability. Claims you've harbored resentment for years and are now fabricating allegations to damage his nomination." Eleanor absorbed this without visible reaction. It was the expected counter-move: discredit the accuser when you can't discredit the facts. And the Baranov connection, no mention. He's compartmentalizing the threats, addressing only what's public so far. Sullivan pocketed his phone. "We need to move up our timeline. I have a source inside the Pentagon who claims Matheson is expediting something called Project Keystone. Whatever it is, it's happening right after his confirmation." Eleanor nodded, processing this new information. "We need to get to Washington sooner than planned. The dynamics have shifted. We can't wait for the hearing to make our case. We need to be working the back channels now." As they spoke, another black SUV pulled up alongside them. The window lowered to reveal a woman in her early 50s. Her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. "Colonel Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the crisp precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Margaret Winters, Department of Defense, Inspector General's office. I believe we need to talk." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Sullivan, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. The Deputy Inspector General's involvement could change everything for better or worse. "I was just heading to Washington," Eleanor replied. Winter's thin smile held no warmth. "How fortunate. I have room for one more on the government jet." The flight to Washington aboard the Inspector General's aircraft was a study in controlled tension. Margaret Winters was not given to small talk or unnecessary pleasantries. She spent the first hour reviewing documents in silence, occasionally making notes in precise handwriting. Eleanor matched her silence, gazing out the window at the landscape passing below, mentally preparing for the battles ahead. Finally, Winters closed her folder and fixed Eleanor with an appraising stare. "For the record, Colonel, I'm neither your ally nor your enemy. The Inspector General's office exists to investigate allegations of misconduct and mismanagement within the Department of Defense. Your case and the accusations against Colonel Matheson fall squarely within our purview." Eleanor nodded, understanding the careful neutrality. "May I ask what prompted your involvement now after 12 years? "Three things," Winters replied, ticking them off on her fingers. "First, the impending promotion of Colonel Matheson to a position with significant authority over special operations. Second, the evidence General Reynolds has accumulated, suggesting the original investigation was compromised. And third, this." She produced a photograph similar to the one Sullivan had shown Matheson meeting with Baranov, but from a different angle with clearer resolution. "You've been watching him," Eleanor observed. "Let's say certain financial irregularities had already placed Colonel Matheson on our radar before your story broke." Winter's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a flash of what might have been respect. "Your decision during Operation Red Dune represents a classic ethical dilemma, Colonel. The tension between following orders and moral obligation is as old as military service itself." Eleanor considered her response carefully. The chain of command exists for good reason, but when that chain fails, when commanders make decisions based on career preservation rather than operational reality, someone has to stand in the gap. "At considerable personal cost," Winters noted. "Some prices are worth paying." The conversation shifted to practicalities. The congressional hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning. Winters' team had already subpoenaed the complete operational records from Red Dune, including communications logs that had been excluded from the original investigation. Eleanor would need to prepare formal testimony coordinate with Reynolds and be ready for aggressive questioning from Matheson's allies on the committee. As they began their descent into Andrews Air Force Base, Winters delivered a final assessment. "Matheson has powerful friends, Colonel. Members of Congress, defense contractors, former military officers now in lucrative consulting positions. They'll fight to protect him because his fall would threaten their own interests." She closed her briefcase with a decisive click. "But he's made a critical error." "What's that?" Eleanor asked. Winter's smile was cold and precise, as a surgeon's scalpel. He's created too many victims. The operators you saved, the subordinates he's bullied, the regulations he's bent. Every ethical corner he's cut has left someone nursing a grudge waiting for the opportunity to speak out. Your story has given them that opportunity. The aircraft touched down with a gentle bump, taxiing toward a hangar where several official vehicles waited. Among them, Eleanor recognized Reynolds' staff car. "One last thing," Winter said as they prepared to disembark. "Whatever happens in the hearing, whatever evidence emerges about Matheson's activities with Baranov, be prepared for blowback. Men like Matheson don't go down quietly." Eleanor nodded, understanding the warning all too well. The path ahead was fraught with danger not just to her reputation or career prospects, but potentially to her physical safety. Matheson had demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice operators in the field. What would he do when his own future was at stake? As she stepped onto the tarmac, the warm Washington air heavy with humidity, Eleanor felt the weight of the moment. 12 years ago, she had stood alone against the military establishment, fighting for the lives of 42 operators. Now she stood here, again fighting for truth, for accountability, for the future of the special operations community. Reynolds approached, saluting her with the same respect he had shown in Benson's cafe. But this time, they weren't putting on a show for locals. This was one warrior acknowledging another regardless of the stars on his shoulder or the civilian clothes she wore. "Welcome back to the fight, Colonel," he said as they walked toward the waiting vehicles. "The battlefield has changed, but the stakes are just as high." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening like tempered steel. The quiet life in Montana seemed a lifetime away now. Ahead lay Washington with its power brokers and political machinations, its hearings and headlines. A different kind of war, but one she was prepared to wage. For 12 years, she had lived with the consequences of choosing what was right over what was ordered. She had accepted exile, anonymity, the loss of the career she had built. But now, as the Capitol's monuments came into view, Eleanor Hayes made a silent promise to herself. This time, she wouldn't be the only one facing consequences. The Hart Senate office building stood as a monument to American governance, its neoclassical facade gleaming in the morning sun as crowds gathered outside. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointing skyward, reporters delivering breathless updates to a nation suddenly captivated by the story of Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes. What had begun as a military procedural hearing had transformed overnight into political theater of the highest order, complete with protesters carrying signs declaring "Justice for Hayes" and "Accountability Matters." Inside Hearing Room 216, staffers made final preparations, adjusting microphones and testing recording equipment as security personnel conducted last-minute sweeps. The room's elevated dais where senators would sit in judgment loomed over the witness table like a secular altar. American flags flanked a Department of Defense seal symbols of the institutions whose integrity hung in the balance. 3 floors below, in a small preparation room, Eleanor Hayes sat alone, dressed in her formal Army uniform, for the first time in 12 years. The fabric felt simultaneously foreign and familiar against her skin, the weight of the medals and ribbons on her chest, a physical reminder of battles fought and honors earned. Her reflection in the room's small mirror showed a woman transformed, no longer the anonymous resident of Oak Ridge, Montana, but a soldier returned to duty. A soft knock preceded General Reynolds' entrance. He, too, wore his formal uniform, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder. "5 minutes, Colonel," he said, his voice calm but tense with anticipation. "Are you ready?" Eleanor nodded, rising from her chair with fluid precision despite her lingering limp. "As ready as I'll ever be." They had spent the past 4 days in intensive preparation, reviewing documents, rehearsing testimony, anticipating attack lines from Matheson's allies on the committee. Inspector General Winters had provided unprecedented access to classified materials, including communications logs that had been deliberately excluded from the original investigation. Mark Sullivan had worked his journalistic connections, securing statements from several Delta Force operators who had been part of Team Sigma, all confirming Eleanor's version of events. But the most damning evidence had come from an unexpected source, Major Thomas Phillips himself, the intelligence officer who had cleared the extraction route during Red Dune. Approached by Winters' investigators, facing the possibility of criminal charges for falsifying intelligence assessments, Phillips had broken his long silence. His sworn affidavit admitted that he had been pressured by Colonel Matheson to downplay insurgent activity along Route Bravo, despite clear evidence of potential hostiles in the area. As they walked toward the hearing room, Reynolds briefed Eleanor on last-minute developments. Matheson arrived an hour ago through a service entrance to avoid the press. His legal team has been trying to limit the scope of questioning, claiming national security concerns. Reynolds' voice betrayed a hint of satisfaction. Senator Gardner isn't having it. As committee chair, he's ruled that the full operational record is admissible. Eleanor processed this with cautious optimism. Gardner, a Desert Storm veteran himself, had been quietly supportive throughout the preparations, recognizing the hearing's importance beyond the immediate question of Matheson's promotion. "What about Project Keystone?" she asked, referring to the mysterious initiative Sullivan had uncovered. "Still murky, but we have confirmation that it involves next-generation targeting systems for special operations. Matheson has been fast-tracking procurement outside normal channels." Reynolds lowered his voice as they approached the hearing room doors. Baranov's specialty is acquiring Western military technology for foreign clients. The implications were clear. Matheson wasn't just covering up past mistakes, he was potentially engaged in treason, selling advanced American military capabilities to hostile powers. The stakes had escalated far beyond Eleanor's personal vindication. As they reached the entrance, Reynolds paused for a final word. "Whatever happens in there, remember that 42 families had sons, husbands, and fathers come home because of your decision. No congressional hearing can take that away from you." Eleanor nodded, squaring her shoulders. The door swung open, revealing a packed chamber. Cameras swiveled toward her, flashbulbs erupted, and a buzz of conversation rose before falling into hushed anticipation. She walked the long aisle toward the witness table with military bearing, her eyes fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the stares of curiosity or the barely concealed hostility from Matheson's supporters. At the witness table, she remained standing until formally invited to sit by Senator Gardner, whose silver hair and weathered face spoke of his own military service. "This hearing will come to order," Gardner announced, gaveling the room to silence. "Today we consider two matters before this committee: the nomination of Colonel Robert Matheson to the rank of Lieutenant General and oversight of Operation Red Dune conducted in Iraq in 2003. He surveyed the room, his expression grave. "Let me be clear about our purpose here. This is not a trial. It is not a court-martial. It is a fact-finding mission essential to this committee's constitutional duty of military oversight." Eleanor's gaze briefly shifted to where Matheson sat with his legal team. Now in his early 60s, he had aged into a man whose ramrod posture and carefully controlled expression spoke of someone accustomed to power. Their eyes met briefly across the room, his cold and calculating, hers steady and uncompromising. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," Gardner continued, "you have been called before this committee to testify regarding your role in Operation Red Dune and subsequent events. Do you understand that you are under oath and that knowingly providing false testimony constitutes perjury?" "I do, Senator," Eleanor replied, her voice clear and steady. "Then please proceed with your opening statement." Eleanor took a breath, centering herself. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in tactical operations centers from Baghdad to Kabul. "Mr. Chairman, distinguished committee members, I come before you today not to seek personal vindication, but to establish historical truth. On April 17, 2003, during Operation Red Dune, I served as forward tactical analyst in the command center at Camp Liberty, Baghdad. My responsibility was to monitor satellite imagery and provide real-time intelligence to Delta Force Team Sigma as they conducted a high-priority capture mission near Fallujah. She described with military precision how she had identified the pattern of insurgent movements, that intelligence had missed the telltale signs of an ambush being prepared along the team's primary extraction route. When I brought these concerns to command's attention, they were dismissed. Major Phillips, the intelligence officer responsible for route clearance, insisted the heat signatures were local shepherds, despite movement patterns consistent with insurgent tactics we had observed in previous operations. Eleanor's voice remained steady as she recounted the critical moment, her decision to break the chain of command, to contact the Air Force Combat Controller embedded with Delta Team Sigma directly to redirect air support against the protocol. I knew the consequences of my actions even as I made them, but I also knew that 42 American operators would die if I followed procedure. Their lives and the tactical intelligence they had secured would be lost. I chose to act rather than allow men to die due to a failure in the command structure. For the next hour, Eleanor fielded questions from committee members, some supportive, others openly hostile. Senator Caldwell, a known ally of Matheson, attempted to portray her as emotionally unstable, suggesting that her judgment had been compromised by the stress of deployment. Colonel Hayes, isn't it true that you had been working excessive hours in the weeks leading up to Red Dune? He pressed his tone, dripping with false concern. No more than any other officer in a combat theater, Senator, Eleanor replied calmly. My duty logs show standard rotation schedules. And yet you alone claim to see this supposed ambush pattern that experienced intelligence officers missed. Eleanor's response was measured but firm. I didn't claim anything, Senator. The satellite imagery captured the pattern. It's there in the record for anyone with proper training to see. She leaned slightly forward. The difference was not what I saw, but that I was willing to act on it when others chose bureaucratic safety over operational reality. Throughout her testimony, Eleanor maintained her composure, refusing to be baited into emotional outbursts or defensive posturing. When presented with the original investigation's conclusions that she had acted rashly and endangered the mission, she simply pointed to the contrasting evidence. Now before the committee, the unredacted satellite imagery, the combat controller's after-action report confirming the insurgent presence, and most damning of all, Major Phillips's sworn statement admitting intelligence had been deliberately manipulated. After 3 hours of grueling testimony, Senator Gardner called a 30-minute recess. As Eleanor rose from the witness table, her legs stiff from prolonged sitting, she felt a presence at her side. Mark Sullivan had slipped into the row behind her. You're doing great, he murmured, barely audible over the din of the room clearing. But there's a development. We've confirmed that Matheson has accelerated Project Keystone. The technology transfer to Baranov is happening tonight, not next week as we thought. We have to move faster. Eleanor absorbed this information with outward calm, though her mind raced with implications. If they waited for the committee's formal proceedings to conclude, the damage would already be done, critical military technology in the hands of America's adversaries. Find Reynolds, she instructed Sullivan quietly. Tell him we need to implement Contingency Plan Delta immediately. Sullivan nodded and disappeared into the crowd as Eleanor was escorted to a small anteroom for the recess. Inside, she found Margaret Winters waiting, a secure tablet in her hands. You've made quite an impression, Colonel. Winters observed, her clipped tone betraying nothing of her personal assessment. The committee seems to be shifting. Even Matheson's allies are starting to distance themselves. It won't matter if Project Keystone proceeds, Eleanor replied, accepting the water bottle Winters offered. We've learned the timetable has been accelerated. Winters' eyes narrowed fractionally. My office has been monitoring unusual financial transfers from offshore accounts linked to Baranov. A significant sum was moved 3 hours ago. She handed Eleanor the tablet. This is a secure communication from my field team. We've located the meeting point, a private airfield in rural Virginia. Matheson is scheduled to arrive at 2100 hours tonight. Eleanor studied the information, noting the airfield's remote location and limited access points, a perfect setting for a clandestine exchange. We need to notify FBI counterintelligence. Already done, Winters confirmed. But there's a complication. Matheson has deep connections throughout the intelligence community. We can't be certain who can be trusted. If he gets wind of an operation, he'll disappear with the technology. The door opened, admitting General Reynolds and Sullivan. The four of them formed an impromptu war council, speaking in hushed tones as they assessed options. We need eyes on the exchange, Reynolds said, reviewing the airfield schematics on Winters' tablet. Conclusive evidence of Matheson handing over classified technology. My people can handle surveillance, Winters offered. But we need a direct witness with unimpeachable credibility for the eventual prosecution. All eyes turned to Eleanor. You're thinking I should be there, she stated immediately, grasping the strategic logic. Reynolds nodded grimly. Your testimony today has established you as the counter to Matheson. If you witness the exchange directly, it creates a powerful narrative, the officer he tried to destroy, catching him in the act of treason. Eleanor considered the risks. Leaving the hearing before its conclusion could undermine her credibility. Being caught in an unauthorized operation could result in charges against her. But the alternative, allowing cutting-edge military technology to fall into hostile hands, was unthinkable. How do we play it? she asked, her mind already shifting to tactical planning mode. You continue testimony after recess. Winters outlined, we need to maintain the appearance of normal proceedings. Once the day's session concludes, you will be transported to our field office for additional questioning. From there, we move to the surveillance position near the airfield. The plan took shape, quickly drawing on each of their unique skills and authorities. Reynolds would maintain presence at the hearing, keeping Matheson's attention focused on the public spectacle. Sullivan would use his journalistic cover to monitor communications and provide early warning of any changes. Winter's team would establish a secure perimeter around the airfield, with FBI counterintelligence positioned to make arrests once the exchange was documented. Eleanor would be the linchpin, the witness whose testimony would be irrefutable. The officer whose presence would complete the narrative arc that had begun 12 years ago in a dusty tactical operations center in Baghdad. When the recess ended, she returned to the witness table with renewed purpose. The afternoon's session proved even more intense than the morning's questioning, with Matheson's allies becoming increasingly desperate in their attempts to discredit her. Yet Eleanor sensed the shifting mood in the room. Senators, who had been skeptical, were now leaning forward, engaged by the mounting evidence of command failure during Red Dune. At precisely 1700 hours, Senator Gardner gavelled the day's proceedings to a close, announcing that Colonel Matheson would testify the following morning. As the room cleared, Eleanor was approached by two of Winter's agents, who escorted her discreetly from the building through a service corridor, avoiding the press scrum at the main entrance. Within an hour, she had changed from her formal uniform into tactical clothing: dark cargo pants, a black compression shirt, and a lightweight tactical vest. Her hair was secured tightly, her movements focused and economical as she reviewed the operation parameters with Winter's team in a nondescript warehouse that served as their staging area. Surveillance indicates Baranov arrived at a private residence 30 minutes ago. The lead agent reported displaying thermal imagery on a large monitor. We expect him to proceed to the airfield at approximately 20-30 hours. Matheson's security detail has established a perimeter, but they're maintaining a low profile to avoid attention. Eleanor studied the airfield layout, mentally cataloging approach vectors, lines of sight, potential cover positions. Even after years away from active operations, the tactical assessment came naturally, a skill set that had never truly faded. What's our insertion point? She asked, noting the heavily wooded area surrounding the small runway. Here, the agent indicated a service road that approached from the northeast. We'll drop a two-person team, you and Agent Ramirez, at this point. There's a maintenance shed with clear sight lines to the main hangar, perfect observation post with minimal exposure risk. As darkness fell over Virginia, Eleanor found herself in the rear of an unmarked van, seated beside Agent Ramirez, a compact, serious woman whose economy of movement marked her as someone with special operations background. They rode in professional silence, each mentally preparing for the mission ahead. Eleanor's thoughts drifted briefly to Oak Ridge, the quiet life she had built, the simple routines that had sustained her through years of exile. Whatever happened tonight, that life was over. She had stepped back into the arena, chosen once again to stand rather than remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. The future beyond this night remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes had reclaimed her identity, her purpose. The van slowed as it approached the drop point, coming to a stop in a darkened stretch of road a mile from the airfield perimeter. Eleanor and Ramirez exited silently, communication devices, checked weapons, secured. They moved through the dense Virginia woods with practiced stealth, avoiding the security patrols visible through their night vision equipment. The maintenance shed proved an ideal observation post, its elevated position offering clear views of the hangar where Matheson's security team had established their position. Eleanor and Ramirez settled in their specialized camera equipment, capable of capturing high-resolution images even in near-total darkness. At precisely 2127 hours, headlights appeared on the access road, a convoy of 3 vehicles approaching the airfield with military discipline. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she recognized Matheson's distinctive silhouette emerging from the center vehicle, flanked by 2 security personnel. He carried a hardened case, the kind used for transporting sensitive electronic equipment. Target confirmed, she whispered into her communications device, triggering a series of acknowledgments from the FBI teams positioned around the perimeter. Minutes later, a second vehicle arrived, a luxury SUV with diplomatic plates. Viktor Baranov emerged, accompanied by a single assistant. The Russian arms dealer moved with the confident swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable, protected by the web of connections and compromised officials he had cultivated over decades. Second target confirmed, Eleanor reported. Exchange appears imminent. Through her high-powered optics, she watched as Matheson and Baranov met at the center of the hangar. Words were exchanged, handshakes offered with the false camaraderie of men united only by mutual benefit. Then Matheson placed the case on a small table between them, opening it to reveal a complex electronic system, the targeting array at the heart of Project Keystone. Eleanor's finger pressed the capture button on her camera, documenting the moment when treason became irrefutable. As Baranov leaned forward to inspect the technology, Eleanor felt a strange sense of completion, a circle closing after 12 long years. Once again, she was witnessing a critical moment that others would have preferred remained hidden. "We have confirmation," came the quiet voice of the FBI tactical commander over the secure channel. "All teams execute apprehension plan. Repeat, execute apprehension plan." What followed unfolded with the controlled chaos of a well-planned operation. FBI teams converged from multiple directions, their synchronized movements cutting off escape routes as they announced their presence with overwhelming authority. Matheson's security detail, recognizing the futility of resistance against federal agents, surrendered their weapons without incident. Baranov's assistant made a brief, ill-advised attempt to reach for a concealed weapon, only to find himself face down on the concrete floor, restrained by 3 agents. Matheson himself stood frozen in shock, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him in real time. As agents secured the scene, Eleanor and Ramirez emerged from their observation post, approaching the hangar with measured steps. The moment when Matheson saw Eleanor entering the hangar would be seared into her memory forever. His face transformed, first confusion, then recognition, and finally a dawning horror as he understood the symmetry of the moment. The officer whose career he had destroyed had become the architect of his downfall. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," he said, his voice barely audible, as FBI agents secured his wrists with tactical restraints. "You're supposed to be in Washington." "I was," Eleanor replied simply, "but I've learned that sometimes you have to break protocol to serve a higher purpose." As Matheson was led away, Eleanor approached the table where Project Keystone lay exposed, cutting-edge American military technology that would have given adversaries a critical advantage in future conflicts. She closed the case carefully, securing the classified system that had nearly been compromised. Colonel Agent Ramirez called, gesturing toward the hangar entrance where Margaret Winters had arrived, accompanied by senior FBI officials. "Well done, Colonel Hayes," Winters said, her customary reserve giving way to genuine respect. "Once again, your judgment has proven correct under exceptional circumstances." Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement, feeling the weight of the moment. "What happens now?" "Now," Winters replied, "we complete what you started this morning. Matheson will face charges of espionage and treason. His allies will scramble to distance themselves. And you," she paused, studying Eleanor with newfound appreciation, "you have some decisions to make about your future." Dawn was breaking over the Capitol dome as Eleanor Hayes stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, watching the city come alive in the early morning light. She had spent the night providing detailed statements to federal investigators, documenting her observations of the exchange and reviewing the evidence collected at the airfield. Now, in this brief moment of solitude, she contemplated what lay ahead. General Reynolds found her there, approaching with quiet respect for her contemplation. He had aged overnight, the stress of the past days etched more deeply in the lines of his face, but his eyes carried a light of satisfaction that hadn't been there before. "It's over," he said, simply coming to stand beside her. "Matheson is in federal custody. 3 of his closest allies in the Pentagon have resigned already, trying to get ahead of the investigation. The committee has unanimously recommended against his promotion." Eleanor nodded, absorbing the news without visible reaction. "And read Dune. The committee has issued a formal finding that your actions were justified under the circumstances. They're recommending a full review of the original investigation with potential disciplinary action against those who falsified records." Reynolds turned to face her directly. "You've been vindicated, Eleanor, completely and publicly." She closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of those words settle around her. Vindication had been so long in coming that she wasn't sure how to receive it now. "The Secretary of the Army wants to meet with you," Reynolds continued. "There's talk of formal reinstatement to active duty with promotion to full colonel and back pay for the intervening years. Eleanor's expression registered surprise for the first time. Reinstatement after all this time. Your skills are still valuable, Eleanor. Perhaps more valuable now than ever. The military needs officers who understand that moral courage sometimes means standing apart from the chain of command. Reynolds gestured toward the Capitol in the distance. What you did 12 years ago saved lives. What you did yesterday protected national security. That's the kind of leadership we need, especially now. Eleanor considered his words, carefully weighing possibilities she had thought forever close to her. Return to active service. Resume the career that had once defined her. Use her experience to shape a new generation of officers. But something held her back, a recognition that she was no longer the same woman who had sat in that tactical operations center in Baghdad. Her years in Oak Ridge had changed her, given her perspective that couldn't be found within the military structure. I need time to think about it, she said finally. This isn't a decision I can make standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at dawn. Reynolds smiled, understanding in his eyes. Beg all the time you need. The offer isn't going anywhere. As they began walking down the steps, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a message from Mark Sullivan. Story running on front pages across the country. Hero twice over. She pocketed the phone without responding. Hero was never a title she had sought, not in Iraq, not in Washington. She had simply done what she believed was right, regardless of personal cost. That the world now recognized the truth was gratifying, but it didn't change the essential nature of her choices. 1 week later, Eleanor Hayes stood at the lectern in a packed auditorium at West Point. Behind her sat General Reynolds, Margaret Winters, and a row of distinguished military and civilian leaders. Before her sat rows of cadets, future officers, who would one day face their own tests of moral courage. Leadership isn't about rank, she told them, her voice carrying to the far corners of the room. It isn't about following procedures or checking boxes. True leadership, the kind that saves lives and accomplishes missions, is about moral courage. The willingness to stand alone when necessary. The commitment to do what's right, even when it's not what's ordered. She spoke for 30 minutes, sharing the lessons of Red Dune without self-aggrandizement or bitterness. When she concluded, the cadets rose as one, their applause thundering through the historic hall. It wasn't merely respect they were offering, but something deeper. A recognition that the principles she embodied represented the highest ideals of the service they were preparing to enter. Afterward, as she walked across the parade ground with Reynolds, he asked the question that had hung between them since Washington. Have you decided about reinstatement? Eleanor stopped, looking out over the Hudson River, its surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. I have, she said. I'm declining the offer of active duty. Reynolds nodded, not entirely surprised. May I ask why? Because I can serve better in a different capacity. She turned to face him directly. The Secretary of Defense has offered me a position as Special Advisor on Ethical Leadership and Command Integrity. It would allow me to work across service branches, developing training programs and protocols to prevent another Red Dune situation. Understanding dawned in Reynolds' eyes. You'd be able to change the system from the inside without being constrained by the chain of command. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. I've seen both sides now, the necessity of military structure and the dangers when that structure becomes rigid. I think I can help bridge that gap, create space for moral courage within the framework of necessary discipline. They continued walking, their conversation turning to practical matters, where she would be based, when she would start, how they would collaborate in the months ahead. As they neared the administration building, Eleanor paused once more. What about Oak Ridge? Reynolds asked, intuiting her thoughts. Will you miss it? Eleanor smiled, thinking of the small cabin on the mountainside, the quiet mornings at Benson's Cafe, the simple rhythms of the life she had built. Parts of it, she admitted. But it was always a hiding place, not a home. I think I'm ready to stop hiding. 3 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes stood at the podium in a Pentagon briefing room, addressing a group of senior officers from all service branches. On the screen behind her, a new training protocol was displayed, the Hayes Directive on Command Ethics and Moral Courage. The woman who spoke bore little resemblance to the quiet, limping figure who had once sat alone in a Montana cafe. Her posture was commanding, her voice clear and authoritative, her eyes direct and unflinching. The limp remained a permanent reminder of wounds sustained in service, but it no longer defined her. As she concluded her presentation, a hand raised from the back of the room. Colonel Hayes called a young captain. Given your experience, what advice would you offer to officers who find themselves caught between protocol and moral imperative? Eleanor considered the question carefully, aware of the weight her answer would carry. Remember your oath, she said finally. You swore to support and defend the Constitution, not procedures, not protocols, not even the chain of command itself. When those things align, following orders is easy. When they conflict, the harder path is usually the right one. She paused, making eye contact with several officers in turn. And know this, even if you stand alone in the moment, those who truly understand service and sacrifice will stand with you in the end. After the briefing, Eleanor walked the Pentagon's corridors with the confidence of someone who had found her true place. As she passed the wall of heroes' photographs of men and women who had distinguished themselves through exceptional service, she noticed a newly installed addition. There among America's finest was a photograph of her from Operation Red Dune, younger in desert camouflage, intent on the satellite imagery that had revealed the ambush pattern. The caption read simply, Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Hayes, Moral Courage Under Fire. She stood before it for a long moment, not in vanity but in quiet recognition of the journey that had brought her here. From the Tactical Operations Center in Baghdad, to a small Montana cafe from congressional testimony, to a midnight operation at a Virginia airfield, and now to these hallowed halls, a circle completed. As she turned away, a group of young officers passed, stopping to render salutes when they recognized her. Eleanor returned their salutes with perfect military precision, a gesture that acknowledged not just their respect, but the continuity of the values she had fought to uphold. Sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest stories, and Eleanor Hayes' story would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of moral courage and to the truth that heroes often walk among us unrecognized until the moment when principles matter more than protocols, and one person's stand can make all the difference.